In this demo, I'm going to show you how to use namespaces in TypeScript. Since the demo app I've used so far in the course is already configured to use modules, I'm going to start from scratch with a super simple new project. I'm going to start here in the terminal by creating a directory for the new application. I'm going to call it Namespace Demo. I'll go into the new directory and start Visual Studio Code from there. I want to create a new file that will contain several utility functions that can be used throughout the app. I'll name it utilityfunctions.ts. I don't want to just add all of the functions to the global namespace, so I'm going to define a TypeScript namespace and put them inside it. I use the namespace keyword followed by the name of the new namespace. I'll call it utility. The contents of the namespace go inside the curly braces. I'll further categorize my functions by defining a nested namespace inside utility named fees. Notice that the syntax for it is the same with the exception of the export keyword that exposes it on the utility namespace. I'll now write my first function and name it calculate late fee. I'll use it to calculate small fees that are owed when books are returned late to the library. It will take the number of days that the book is late as a parameter and return the amount of the fee. I'll set the fee to be 25 cents per day. Just like I did with the fees namespace, I also have to put the export keyword in front of the function to make it available on the namespace. I'll now come down just a bit and use a code snippet to paste in a couple more functions. These are defined outside the fees namespace, but they're still a part of the utility namespace. The max books allowed function calculates the maximum number of books that may be checked out based on a person's age. Kids less than 12 may only check out 3 books, everyone else can check out up to 10. Again, I exported this function from the namespace. I did not export the last function, which I only added as an example of not using the export keyword inside a namespace. This effectively becomes a function that is private to the utility namespace. I can call it from inside the namespace, but it won't be accessible outside it like the functions I've exported. Now that I've got a couple of utility functions defined, I'll add a new file and write some code to call them. I'll name the file app.ts. If I open the new file and immediately try to call one of the new functions using the utility namespace in the dot notation, you see that it's not working. I'm not getting any code completion help and Visual Studio Code doesn't seem to know what utility refers to. I need to add a / reference to the file containing the namespace. Visual Studio Code comes with a code snippet named ref that will paste in a reference. I'll specify utilityfunctions.ts for the path attribute. With that in place, I can start typing the same line of code again, and you can see that Visual Studio Code is giving me lots of helpful information. I can see that the utility namespace contains another namespace named fees and a function named maxBooksAllowed. Notice that I don't see the private function that I didn't export from the namespace. I'll call the calculate late fee function inside the fees namespace and assign it to a variable. I'll then just log the value in the variable. Everything looks good, but I want to show you one little trick that can reduce the amount of typing you have to do if you need to call a bunch of functions nested inside namespaces. You can use the import keyword to define an alias for a namespace. I'm going to create an alias for the utility.fees namespace and name it util. You just use the import keyword followed by the name of the alias and assign it the fully qualified namespace. With that in place, I can now change the code below to just call util.calculateLateFee. Okay, let's try compiling and running this code back in the terminal. Remember that the TypeScript compiler is just named TSC. I'll use the -- target option to tell it to output ES5 JavaScript and then tell it to compile just app.ts. This only takes a second to run. I'll type ls so we can see a list of files that are now in this directory. In addition to the original TypeScript files, app.ts and utilityfunctions.ts, I also have JavaScript versions of both files, even though I only instructed the compiler to compile app.ts. That's because the compiler saw the reference to utilityfunctions.ts inside of app.ts and automatically compiled it as well. I'm now going to try to run the program by typing node space app.js. That gives me an error. Node doesn't recognize the utility namespace, which was defined in another file. That's because Node wants to load multiple files using modules, not namespaces. However, I will point out that the way I built and compiled this would work fine for a client-side web application. I've got two JavaScript files. I could just add a script tag for utilityfunctions.js first, and then another one for app.js, and it would all work great. This can be made to work with Node though. As I mentioned in the slides, we can use the --out file compiler option to have all of the required source files compiled into a single output JavaScript file. I'll bring up the tsc command again and just add to the end of it --out file out.js. It should now compile both TypeScript files and produce one output file named out.js. I'll use Node to run that file, and you can now see that it works correctly.